Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting webinar. We're going to wait maybe 1 to 2 more minutes because I see people are still joining, so we'll give them a chance to get settled in and make sure they're connected to audio and everything, and then we'll get started. So stay tuned for maybe a minute or two more. Alrighty, so 2 minutes are over. Let's get started. Again, welcome to our webinar today. We were supposed to have this session at the SAP Insider Conference in Las Vegas, actually right now at this time of the day. But unfortunately, as I'm sure most of you have heard, the conference got postponed. In hindsight, fortunately, they made the decision. I think nobody would want to travel right now. So thanks for making the time and for joining our webinar alternative to the on-site session. I actually used the very same presentation that I had planned on using at the SAP Insider Conference and that I will be using at the SAP Insider Conference in August. So I hope SAP Insider doesn't mind me using their slide deck theme, but I didn't want to redo it all in Xiting. On the Xiting theme. So today's session is about S/4HANA lessons learned and some best practice approach to migrating your security concept, meaning your roles and authorizations from ECC or the business suite to SAP S/4HANA. Fortunately, for many, SAP has announced they pushed back that deadline from 2025 to 2027, and then you can get some extra for very expensive maintenance if you want to drag it out even more. But that certainly helps many of SAP's customers to maybe have more time to prepare for that migration. And again, today we're going to focus on the security aspect of that migration. And I had originally planned a slide-based demo of how that migration can look like, but I decided I'm going to do it in our demo system here. So hopefully nothing goes wrong and VPN holds and everything. I also hope that none of you have any issues with the GoToWebinar control panel. We've had some issues with GoToMeeting in the last few days, probably because they have more traffic right now than they usually do, considering that many people are working from home. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to address. One is if you have any questions, and one of you at least has already found the questions box, but use that questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel to send us any questions that you might have. I have Alessandro Banzer with me on the webinar, and he is keeping an eye on the questions box and hopefully answers anything that he can during the webinar. So don't be afraid to just type it in as questions pop into your head. Otherwise, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. I don't think I'll speak much longer than maybe 45 minutes, probably even shorter, depending on how carried away I get. And so we should have plenty of time to do Q&A. Also, this webinar will be recorded. It's recording already, and you will get a link to the recording. One email automatically sent by GoToWebinar within 24 hours. But as soon as the recording is ready, I'll upload it to YouTube, and I will send out a follow-up email to everyone with the link to the YouTube video, as well as to a PDF version of this slide deck. So you can look at that stuff again and look at some of the screenshots that I will try to cover in that live demo today. And I think that is pretty much it, what I wanted to go through. So with that said, let's get started. Let's look at some of the lessons learned, lessons that we've learned as part of the migration project that we've done. In addition to that, and before we really begin with any of the lessons learned, I'm going to talk a little bit high level about S4, what it is, what's new, what has changed in terms of data model, in terms of security, etc. And most of you probably know all of that already, but for those of you who don't, this should get you up to speed and make sure we're really all on the same page before we jump into some of the security aspects, like new transaction codes, obsolete transaction codes, what needs to change, what is the best practice to move your roles from A to B, or even to create and design new roles if you decide to do a greenfield migration or a greenfield implementation rather than a system conversion. And so those are some of the things that we'll cover today, and probably a little bit more than what I have here on the agenda, but just a few words at the beginning about Xiting, who we are, what we do. Then we talk about the high level overview, what's new in S4. We talk about best practices. Again, from a security perspective, I know there is significantly more to an S4 migration than security, but security tends to be forgotten, or at least tends to have a lower priority than we and role admins probably would like to see. And the implication of not giving the security aspects of your migration sufficient priority is that you might run into issues with role testing or with incompatible roles that could potentially then delay or derail your project. So it's very important to give your security team a seat at the table when you start planning your migration to S4, and to account for the time it takes to either design new roles or to migrate your existing ones, depending on how good your existing role concept is, how maybe how many SODs you have that you might want to fix in the process, etc. And then we talk about, then I'll show you the demo. Again, it's this time I'm going to do it live, or I try to do it live in our demo system. I have a regular ECC and an S4 system here that I can log into. We talk about lessons learned, and we'll wrap it up and have any questions and answers that you guys might have. Well, your questions and hopefully my or Alessandro's answers. So just a few words about Xiting. Before we get started, we were founded in 2008 by SAP security consultants, and most of those consultants are also certified SAP trainers, so they deliver a lot of the training classes and courses that you can book directly with SAP. If you go to trainingsap.com. We're headquartered in Switzerland. We have an office obviously in Switzerland, in Germany, in England, Romania, and here in the US we're based out of Tampa, Florida. And someone says they don't see the presentation. And that is most likely because I didn't share my screen. So thank you. That would have been a very boring demo if you couldn't see the screen. So I apologize about that. Now you can hopefully see the screen. Hands up if you don't. Cool. So you're gonna get a cookie, Peter, afterwards for being so attentive. So offices, around the world, mostly in Europe and here in the US, based out of Tampa, Florida. I'm from Atlanta, and not originally, of course, as you can hear, but I live here and work out of the Atlanta area. So that's just briefly about Xiting. And now let's take a quick look at what's new in S4, and then we'll kind of take a little bit of a turn and focus more on the security aspect. So S4 is obviously a new product line. It's going to be, now it looks like by 2027-ish, the center of our and your future data world. Hopefully by then you have migrated a substantial portion of your landscape either to S4, or maybe you took a different decision and decided not to go with SAP anymore. But since you're on this webinar, I assume you're going to be in S4 at some point. And what SAP has done is they've tried hard to come up with having only one solution for each requirement, meaning that, and just to give you a very simple example here, registering a vendor invoice. Today in the legacy business suite, you can do it either in MM or in FI. So there are two modules that provide the same capability, and in S4, that SAP has consolidated that capability into one process called invoice management, or one application called invoice management, however you want to see it. And the clear advantage of that is obviously that it's much easier to maintain, especially from a security perspective, because there is now only one maybe T code that can do something that used to be available in 2 or 3 different T codes. So it's easier from a security admin perspective to properly authorize certain business processes and users to for those processes. It also means maybe it's easier on you in terms of user training, because there's only one way of doing things. You only need to take one set of screenshots to teach someone how to register a vendor invoice. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be, MM specific maybe, or FI specific screenshots. It's all gonna be in one process, one application, one transaction. And with that consolidation comes a reduction of applications and transactions. And as you can imagine, reducing transactions and removing obsolete ones, replacing them potentially with others that replace not only one, but a host of different legacy transactions. If you imagine that, and you can also imagine that this has a direct impact on your roles and authorizations, because any of your existing roles that have and contain those legacy and obsolete transactions or authorization objects will have to be updated. And so what's important to understand is that the path to S4 is not a direct upgrade. And I think the misconception a couple of years ago that it is kind of like an upgrade was because SAP pitched a system conversion as the recommended way of moving ECC to S4. That's no longer the case. Now SAP recommends a greenfield implementation, so you don't take any of your legacy stuff, or at least not all of your legacy stuff, with you to S4. You can use the opportunity of going to S4 to maybe reinvent and take a closer look at your existing business processes and make changes that benefit your business. So it's not only, or it doesn't only have to be a technical upgrade, it can be more than that, depending on how you're set up right now. But the bottom line really is, it's not a direct upgrade. It's not as simple as a direct upgrade, and it has significant implications on your existing security and role concept. And that's really the key takeaway. If you don't remember anything else from today's webinar, remember that security is important and it impacts your migration overall, and you want that impact to be a positive one, ideally, and not something that derails or delays your project. So from there are a couple of areas where SAP has made those consolidations, and let's look at it from an architecture perspective first. We already talked about the new and changed functions, pertains to a large degree to transactions. There is also an impact on system architecture, meaning some of the modules have been consolidated. We'll see an example of that here in the next few slides. And there are user interfaces like Fiori Launchpad, and that you might be using today already. If so, you're already familiar and the users are already familiar with those. But in some cases, some of the end user facing capabilities might get moved from a SAP GUI to a browser-based user interface to make it easier for your users. Those new apps are responsive. It doesn't matter what device you use, they all look good, and they always look good and kind of the same, and they're cross-platform, etc. So you might be using more of those newer UIs, and if so, there are additional consideration when it comes to security that you would have to take into account. From an architecture perspective, when you deploy S4 or S4HANA, you get a core stack of modules, and you can see them here on the left. And there's been some discussion about HCM lately. The plan, I think, as of right now, is to move HCM into the S4 core stack. But then there is also a lot of talk about not continuing to add features to HCM. So we'll see how that's going to play out. But at least as of right now, none of the cloud solutions like SuccessFactors, for example, can completely replace an on-prem HCM. So, you know, I don't know exactly what's going to happen to HCM and what SAP is going to do with it, but I don't necessarily expect that all the capabilities will move into a cloud solution. At least not, at least SuccessFactors today doesn't have all the capabilities. And the same is true for some of the other cloud solutions. However, there is a lot of integration scenarios and integration opportunities. And if you decide to go with a cloud solution, then chances are you're going to end up with a hybrid scenario with some on-prem capabilities. And by on-prem, I mean it could be literally on-premise, or it could be, you know, a private cloud tenant maybe, where you still retain full control over the S4 core system. So, you know, there are different cloud offerings from SAP, but when I say on-prem, I mean you have full control over the application, basically. Like with SuccessFactors, you don't. You get a tenant and you have only limited control over. You cannot reconfigure the system, the backend system, for example. From a new and changed functions perspective, there are a couple of things that you have to take into account and you do before you even get to S4. Like you have to implement a new general ledger, you have to implement the business partner concept, etc. There's also new cache and output management. And here is another example of where SAP has consolidated several obsolete transaction codes like MB1A, MB04, MB31 into a quote-unquote new transaction, MIGO. So if you have users and roles that are currently authorized for any of these legacy transactions and you move to S4, then you will have to remove those, put in MIGO, and of course with MIGO, you have to add all the corresponding authorization data that comes with MIGO to authorize users for specific tasks. Since MIGO can do more than the individual legacy transactions it replaces, you have to add the corresponding and proper authorization objects that might be, so a MIGO in role A might have different authorization data than MIGO in role B, if that makes sense. Also, the consolidations were not limited to transactions and applications. We also see that certain modules like MM, SLC, and SRM have been consolidated into what's now called sourcing and procurement, or S procurement, as some people say. So, and that goes back then also to a potential change in architecture, like we've discussed on one of the previous slides, where if you hosted some of these modules on dedicated systems with S4, you likely get them all onto one platform. And that concludes the overview of S4. Again, most of you probably knew all of that already. If not, you know, great, there is, you know, some new information. But now let's talk about the impact on security, meaning on roles and authorizations. And one of the critical aspects of moving your authorization concept from ECC to S4 is the mandatory or the enforcement of the business partner concept. So there is a transaction BP that assumes a lot of the capabilities of legacy transactions. I think there are about 40 or so transactions from your current business suite that BP replaces on S4. And practically what that means is that any roles that have customer, vendor, or other master data have to be updated. And updating typically means removing legacy transactions, putting in the new ones, and populating those transactions then with the corresponding authorization data, and, you know, testing everything, etc., etc. So there is potentially significant work to be done to simply move your roles over to S4. And even if you decide, you know what, we're not going to move anything over, we're going to start from scratch, chances are an accountant yesterday will be an accountant tomorrow. So many of the core business processes and core authorization requirements are still the same. So but even if they're not, there are two ways this can go, this migration, from a workload perspective. You either update and fix your old roles, or you design new ones. One way or the other, you will be doing authorization and security work, and that's something you have to take into account and to make sure you have a sufficient timeline to get this done, and to do it in a way that's based on best practice, you know, by leveraging SU24, SAP's authorizations proposals database by building roles, clean roles that don't have any SODs, at least not on a role level, etc. So following all of these best practices, you want to do it right. And because if you don't, you're going to do a redesign in a couple of years, and nobody wants to do a redesign. The other thing is there are new authorization objects and OData services that you will have to take into account, and it's particularly true if you decide to use Fiori. There is another layer of authorization work that you need to do, and if you decide to give certain users direct database access, there are database privileges to take into account. So potentially 1 to 2 more layers of authorization work that you didn't have today. And that's just, as an overview. There are also a couple of obsolete functions in S4, meaning capabilities that SAP has removed, in some cases removed and never brought back, like classical ruleset management, type of cost, CIC. In other cases, something was removed first and then reintroduced later under a different name, like the utilities customer electronic services that later found its way back into S4 1610 as a multi-channel foundation for utilities and public sector. Here is a screenshot of the Fiori Launchpad, the newer user interface that your business users might have to get familiar with. The good news is it looks significantly prettier than SAP GUI. It's usually easier to use. It's responsive. It looks the same on a smartphone as it does on a PC or Mac or tablet. So if you're used to the interface, you can use it on different devices and it always looks the same way. That's great. Now, those tiles you see on there, I think SAP now calls them cards. Those are individual applications, and SAP provides a whole library of those applications that you can use out of the box, more or less. And you can obviously also develop your own. But besides those newer and better looking Fiori apps and UI5 type of applications, S4 underneath is still an ABAP stack. It's an ABAP based application server that happens to have HANA as the underlying database. So what that means is your SAP GUI, your SAP GUI for HTML, your SAP GUI for Java, your Webtoon Pro, etc. All of that remains functional, and that is important because not all of the capabilities and not all of the backend transactions have corresponding Fiori apps. So you will need, in certain, or in many cases even, depending on your business processes, have to go back to SAP GUI, and maybe some users will switch back and forth between Fiori and SAP GUI, depending on what the Fiori app can do, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. Overall, on the Fiori side, there are different types of applications. There are transactional apps, analytical apps, and fact sheet apps. And what you need to do is to properly authorize them is to, first of all, you need OData services. Those are the services that communicate between the front end and the back end. And you need to properly authorize those services. We'll talk about that here in a bit. But if you go to the Fiori app catalog, there's a URL down here, sap.com/Fiori-apps-library. You can see a list of the Fiori apps that SAP provides, and you can see some of the technical information that is important from for you as a role admin, if you are one, or for anyone who is building roles and authorizing those users for those apps. You can find out the technical catalogs required. You can find out the old data services and what transaction those apps replace. And there is a second screenshot. Oh, nice. Let's zoom that out here a little bit. There is a special column. Actually, the first screenshot was an older one. This one is the newer one, where you can see a relevance score. And that's important, not necessarily from a security perspective, but more from a usability and planning perspective, because that tells you to what extent a Fiori application replaces the backend transaction it's associated with. So if you see a score of 3, that means the app pretty much replaces the backend transaction. There is no need to switch back and forth. If you only see a relevant score of 2 or even 1, I don't know that there is a 0 score, That means the app only partially replaces the backend transaction. If that's the case, then you know that there are some things you can do in the Fiori app, or your users can do in the Fiori app, but for everything else, they have to go back to SAP GUI. And so you need to authorize potentially both the Fiori app as well as the backend transaction accordingly for those users who are supposed to use either or. From a pure authorization perspective and from a security work perspective, the good news is that, as I've mentioned, S4 is still an ABAP stack. So all the tools that you or your security team uses today to do authorization work, like creating roles, administrating users, etc., all of that is still the same on S4. So you would still use the profile generator PFCG for any authorization maintenance. You would use SU01 for user maintenance. There is a technical user that you obviously need to authorize properly that connects the application server to the database, etc. And in most cases, or in many cases, only database admins have direct database access. However, there are some use cases for certain reporting capabilities where you want to harness the power of the HANA database without having to go through the application server, where you might want to authorize users and give them direct database access. And if so, then, as I've mentioned before, there are database privileges that you have to take into account to correctly authorize those users to, get to the data they need to get to. But because of the changed data model that we've discussed in the past few minutes, you will end up with at least a partial role redesign, even if it's only a lift and shift of your current concept. If you don't want to do a full-fledged redesign, changing the type of roles you're using, maybe going from composites to single roles, or from task to job-based roles, that's not necessary. But you will have to touch mostly every single role and replace T codes, etc. So it's kind of like a role design, maybe a one with a reduced scope, but nevertheless it's a role design. The only time where you might end up doing significant work on your existing roles is if you're using value or enabler roles, where you split the authorization data from the organizational data. That doesn't play very well with an S4 migration. Or if you have significant SOD conflicts or if you have users that are entirely over-authorized and you fear that with SAP's changed way of measuring licenses, you might end up paying more user licenses because users have access to stuff they don't even need. That may also trigger a more invasive redesign. But that depends on, and this has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. Now, from an architecture perspective, there are a couple of different ways on how you can set up your S4 infrastructure. Obviously, you have your database and your application server, etc. But in the past, there was I'm not sure if it was a recommendation, but it was certainly an option, and still is, to separate the front-end server from the back-end server, meaning that all your Fiori UIs would be on a front-end server, and then you have the S4 system there on the back-end, and have corresponding connections between the front end and the back end. And the major disadvantage of that approach is that if you update the front end server, you also have to update the back end. And if you had one front end server that connected to X number of backends, let's say you had a 1-to-4 relationship, by updating the front end, you also had to update all the 4 backends. And obviously that's could be a more difficult to accomplish if you had to find maintenance windows for now 5 different servers, instead of if you had one front-end server and one backend combined on one physical or virtual box. You could simply update that instance, which would update both components, but it's all on one host, so all the other backends, so to say, would not be impacted. And that's what the recommendation is right now, to have an embedded installation, basically. From a Fiori authorization perspective, we're not going to go into too many details here, but what you should know is that when someone logs into the Fiori Launchpad, there is a set of authorizations that determine what tiles or cards a user can see in the first place. So, and once the user has, or the authority checks have been completed and the launchpad shows certain cards that are available to the user, then a second set of authorizations is kicking in once the user tries to use one of those applications, cards or tiles. So it depends on, first of all, what the user can see, first set of authorizations, and what a user can do with those applications. That's governed by a second set of authorizations. And obviously, you need to bring them together and properly authorize your users in both layers, if you will. Yeah, we can skip over that. That's a fairly technical slide, but one of the things that's important here is that for both the Fiori as well as for the front-end authorizations and the back-end authorizations, you can leverage SU24, SAP's proposals. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit here once we get to the demo. For those of you who are not familiar with SU24, but you can certainly leverage SU24 for both cases, and it's highly recommended. The more proposals you can leverage from SU24, the easier it is to build those roles, both for your front end as well as for the back end. And now, to document all of what I've just discussed and to help you figure out what you need to change in your security and other things, SAP has published a simplification list. And the simplification list is a document with a lot of pages. So you're gonna, well, now you have the time to read, since you can't have any face-to-face meetings or conventions to go to. Read the simplification list, great read. And in the simplification list, basically SAP explains all of that. And one example that I picked out from that simplification list is the chapter that talks about all the legacy transactions that are being replaced with BP, with the business partner transaction. And I think last time I counted them, there are like 30 or 40 or so of, and you can see the list here, obviously. These are all legacy transactions that don't exist anymore on S4. So if you're in an S4 system and you run any of those applications, you'll get a notice that the transaction doesn't exist anymore. And so if you can imagine, if you have any of these transactions in your existing roles, you have to go in, remove them, put in BP. And of course, because BP can now do so much, you have to add the proper authorization data. So it's not just replacing T codes, that's time consuming, but from a complexity perspective, that's the easy part. Figuring out then what authorization data you need for your individual use cases and business processes, that's really where it gets a little bit more dicey. And so that concludes the security overview, so to say. Now let's talk about some of the best practices, and before I'm going to show you the demo. So one of the things that you should do as early as possible is to analyze your existing security concept, to do some sort of security assessment, system analysis, to find out exactly what you have today and what that means in regards to your S4 migration. As I've mentioned, if you're using enabler or value roles today, maybe now is a good time to move away from that concept and do something else, be it composite, single, derived, task-based, function-based, combination of all of that, but maybe not enabler roles. They don't play very well with S4. And the other thing that's important is to involve your leadership and project management team in the security discussion, or on the flip side, to involve your security team and make sure they have a seat at the table and can give you an honest assessment of what it takes to move the security from legacy to S4, either by lifting and shifting and changing and redesigning, or by designing new roles from scratch. It doesn't really matter. The other thing that we highly recommend you do is take the time to update and leverage best practice capabilities that SAP recommends and that you definitely should be doing, like optimizing SU24, doing an SU25 update obviously before, then optimizing SU24 and leveraging the proposals database as much as you can when you make changes to roles or design new roles. And then obviously do your redesign or slash design, and in the process maybe remove too far-reaching authorizations, mitigate SODs, etc., so that you reduce the risk, if there is risk today, and or your potential impact on the amount of license fees you pay to SAP. Also, don't forget, even before you start making changes to your roles, update your GRC rule set and make sure it's S4 compatible. If you're using the global rule set, you can just download the S4 version and then customize it. If you have something very custom, you have to do it quote unquote manually, but it's significantly easier. It takes maybe a few days than it is to update your roles. And you want to have the GRC rule set ready to roll when you make changes to roles, so you can immediately test and check and make sure you don't introduce SODs, and you mitigate SODs basically by redesigning those roles and maybe splitting some access, etc., and reduce your risk overall. And then use automation tools if possible. I'm going to show you some, of course, because we have automation tools for that, but it doesn't really matter who you use. The importance is that there are many tasks that can and should be automated to reduce the risk of human error, impact on your business, and it just wastes time to do stuff manually that a computer can do significantly quicker and better. So with that, let's jump into my demo system instead of going through the slides. So I have two systems here. I have a demo system and an S4 system. Let's start with the regular demo system first. And so the automation tool that I want to show you today is called the Xiting Authorizations Management Suite, or XAMS. And the way you get in, it's an ABAP add-on. So you install it via transport, and then there is our fancy namespace here that can help you get into the XAMS. Now, our demo system is located in Switzerland. I'm in Atlanta. There is a VPN connection in between. Sometimes it's a little slow, so bear with me if it is. But one of the first things that I want to show you is how you can do that assessment, because I think that's so important to understand where you are and to understand how you can get from A to B. And for that assessment, we very often use what we call a role profiler. A role profiler is a report and analysis tool, so we can make a selection of the roles that I want to scan, be it specific ranges or maybe roles created by a particular user. I'm going to go with a user created by user selection, and we're going to make that selection here. And then I can do, just assess, for example, how many manual authorizations do I have in my roles, in my role selection. And if I do, I can look and see what are these manually inserted objects, and it maybe if that's something I can bring in through SU24, that we've discussed before. And speaking of SU24, one easy way to update SU24 is simply by following system rules. There are certain cases, and just to give you an example, if you have for transaction SU01D, the display transaction or the display variant of SU01, the user maintenance transaction, you always need activity 03. That's a rule. I mean, without activity 03, your SU01D won't work. So it only makes sense to have that proposal in SU24. So when you add SU01D to a role menu, you automatically get that proposal in, and you don't have to insert it manually. That makes the role much more maintainable. You can leverage the where used list, so you know exactly how a specific authorization or authorization data came into the role in the first place. And so one of the tools that one of the reports that we give you, here all of them that are SU24 related, is one that tells you if we find any transactions, be it custom or standard, that provide access to tables or views, like in this case, and we don't have the table access proposed in SU24, either via the table group as tabu this or as tabu num, the table name, then we show a red traffic light, and that's an indication for you that you should add that proposal, at least for the group, or better yet, if you want to be more strict and fine-grained, the table name to SU24, and you can do it right here from this report. I mean, technically we put the change on a transport, but practically you can go through this report and decide. It's not meant to blindly add everything to SU24 because not everything makes sense. But if you know what you're doing, you can use this to very quickly, either one by one or in batch, update and optimize SU24. So when you start building roles and adding those T codes here, you get the proper table protection basically proposed from SU24. And that's really the core of what I want to show you here in the role profiler today is the migration of roles to S4 report. And you can see most of those things here have a red X, and that simply indicates that I'm not using this is not an S4 system. So all the HANA database, well, it's not a system that uses HANA as the database. It could be a non-S4 system, I suppose, as well. But I don't have HANA as the database, which is why they're all X'd out. But this one certainly works because this looks at roles. And so based on my role selection up here, I get a list of roles and an indication of how many obsolete objects I have in those roles and how many new objects I would have to introduce to make that role S4 compatible. So if I double click here on that 49, I get a list of transactions that are obsolete. So, XK01, 02, 03, etc. I didn't want to do that. I don't want to jump into the T code. But you could, so you can drill down in every single cell if you want to. But here basically you just see, okay, what are my obsolete objects? What are the replacement? If there is one, like in this case, F03 doesn't have a replacement, so we can remove it, and that's it, right? In other cases, there are replacements, be it a transaction, be it looks like a web service here. And so we see not only the T code or the object name and object type, obviously, we also see a description so we can see what it is. We can jump into SU24 to see what the proposals are right now for the particular object. And we also get a list of OSS nodes that provide us with more information on that particular simplification or replacement. So this gives you a very quick and easy overview of what you need to change. And you could theoretically, if this was a sandbox system, you could simply adjust the role menu for this particular role by removing everything that's obsolete and adding everything that's new. Or you can simply append everything that's new without removing anything that's old. If you want to kind of create a role or update the role in a way that would make it work on both the legacy as well as the S4 system. And then just for the sake of completeness, let me jump into my S4 system here real quick so you can see here are all the reports that are available, and I can, for instance, go into the user details or user privileges or critical authorizations, and all of that goes back to database privileges. So I can do some of the reporting that is not directly related to roles and authorizations, but more to database privileges, and I can report on that as well. And general settings with an indication if there is something off or not. But that was it about the initial assessment. There are obviously a ton of other reports that you can use to complete that assessment, to really figure out how good or bad your existing role concept is. And then the next thing I want to show you is our role designer. That's really where that's the tool you would use to update and design either your existing roles or new roles. So I'm going to load a demo project here, and the role designer at the end of the day is a virtual role design cockpit. So what you can do is you can load your existing users, your existing roles, their assignment to the users, as well as usage data, meaning STO3N data that tells us what users have been doing in the system over the past X number of months. And you can accumulate as much data as you want to. Ideally, when you do an S4 migration or a role redesign, we recommend to have roughly 4 months worth of data. So we have at least a quarter-end closing in there. Ideally, if you have a year-end closing as well, import that as well. The time frame maybe 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after a year-end. So we capture that usage as well. And then in our designer, what we see is depending on what you decided, how you decide to start the project. In my case, I have roles imported from the system. So these exist in the system already, and I've imported them into Role Designer so I can make changes without impacting the actual roles in PFCG. I can also see a list of users, and I can remove that grouping here. And that's basically then just a long list of either transactions or function modules, web services, web infos, etc. So that's my usage data that I want to look at, because whenever I make changes, maybe I want to use the opportunity to double check if the roles I have assigned to my users right now, even before I start the migration, if they fit, or if they provide 500 transactions for users that only use 20. You know, maybe that's an opportunity to clean up a little bit. And I just see we have 15 minutes left. Holy smokes, I'm talking way too much. So I'm gonna make this quick. Bottom line here is you can do a lot of things here. You can assign roles virtually, you can change roles, you can update them, and immediately see how all of that would impact your users. But then the most important aspect from an S4 migration is to load the migration data. And by that, I mean load the simplification list that you'll get from us as a transport, that based on a version of S4 you want to migrate to, that comes with all those simplifications. But now those simplifications are shown based on your roles in that project in here. So whatever you've imported, whatever you decide to migrate, this is what you would see here, what's going to change. And then you can say, yep, I want to make those changes, click enter, and then you see an overview that tells you, okay, this is what has changed. We added 20 new objects to the project, we deleted 5, we updated the usage data, and we adjusted the role menu of the roles we have in here. And then once you're done with that, you can wait a minute for it to refresh. And then you can go into the reports view, and you can say, load the role reports here. And then you can say, okay, now I'm going to go ahead and generate or regenerate those roles in PFCG. So now you have the roles updated and migrated, and at that point you would bring in your SU24 data to finalize those roles. And with that, I'm going to go back here to my slide deck, and I'm going to skip all of that. And the last part I want to show you real quick is how you can automate role testing, because once you have done your role design and your role migration, now it's time to test, to find out what gaps you still have. Because based on everything we've done so far, there is still a lot of authorization data that might be missing. And so what you can leverage, or what we can leverage, is a role called SAP_app. That can be generated with SAP native tools. So this is not something exciting specific. SAP provides the capability to create a special role that has all application access. So it's not SAP all that provides all access, all access. This one only provides all application access. And the reason why we do this is because what we can do is now we can go to our test system, we give our test user SAP app, meaning all application access, and we give a standard SAP reference user. So this is a standard reference user type. We assign the reference user to the dialog or test user, and we give that reference user the roles that we've migrated from ECC, because we want to find out what is the delta between all access that allows the tester to run through the full test script without ever being stopped, and our newly migrated roles. And the reason why we leverage that reference user is because whenever the SAP kernel performs an authority check, it always does it against the reference user first. And if that fails because something is missing here, maybe we forgot to authorize BP properly, but here with SAP app, the tester obviously can execute BP and do its thing, or his or her thing. So if whenever the SAP kernel fails, or the authority check fails here, but then succeeds here, all of which is completely transparent to the tester or dialog user, then we get a return code 0. So 0 means something is missing here that the user was ultimately able to do because of the SAP app role. And that's delta we can report on. So we can look at all the return code 0s and we see exactly, was it the object, was it the field, was it the value, was it the org field or value that was missing? We can take this information, go back to our S4 dev system, update the role and or SU24, transport the changes up to the test system, and run through the test one more time. And if we no longer see any more return code 0s, then we are done with testing. And that is in comparison to the back and forth where tester tries, gets stuck, role admin runs a trace, tries to figure out what's missing, fixes the role, tester tries again. That whole back and forth elongates the test cycle unnecessarily. Instead, you can just do it this way, run through it once, look at all the gaps, fix them, run through it again, confirm everything is fixed, and you're ready to move on. And that's what you can do ultimately with our automation tool, with the XAMS, or the Xiting Authorizations Management Suite, which also carries an endorsement that we are very proud of from SAP. There is an OSS note that explains why you should be using the XAMS specifically for RFC optimizations. And with that, we're gonna go to lessons learned and then immediately to Q&A, because we are a little bit short on time. But from a lessons learned perspective, SAP Simplification List is incomplete, and that's just, it's a living document. It gets updated every so often, but there is always something that might not be documented at all, or not in a way that makes sense to you. One good example is, and I'm not sure if it's still true with 1909, by the way, this is from the previous version, but for BP, and especially for display access, you still needed to authorize the user for XK03 and XT03, even though those two transactions didn't even exist on the system anymore, but they were still being checked as part of the authority checks inside the code of the BP transaction. And there are also some authorization objects that are still being checked. So some of that doesn't make sense. I'm sure will get fixed eventually, or maybe it has already, but those are the kind of things that you stumble across when you go through your migration project. Also, one way or the other, you will be doing security work. So you will be designing or redesigning roles and authorizations. And if you do, make sure you follow SAP best practices, you leverage SU24, SU25, you use automation tools wherever possible, unless you don't want to save time and money. If you obviously, with especially the test automation tools, you can significantly reduce the impact on your business and your functional users and your test leads. And when you do make changes to roles and authorizations, take the licensing and GDPR compliance into account, and don't forget to update your GRC rule set, which should actually come before you start making changes to roles and authorizations. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Here are two more links. You'll get them as part of the slide deck that you can do some further reading in terms of business role maintenance for the Fiori Launchpad. SAP has simplified that. There are some OSS notes that you can put in to help with that. And there is a good article on the SCN about BW for HANA migration and how that relates to authorizations. And key points to take home, we covered most of them already, so I'm not gonna go through them again. But with that, we're gonna open it up to questions. And I'm not sure how many of these Alessandro has already.
Shall I address the most common ones?
Yeah, please do.
So one of the questions was whether it's recommended or whether it's a good approach to do a redesign before migrating to S/4HANA. So let's assume someone has a very messy design, a crappy design right now on ECC. Would you say it's recommended to redesign before moving, or it's better to do it after?
I'm answering?
Yep.
Okay. Well, that is a very good question, and there isn't really a right or wrong answer. It really depends on your timeline, your budget, and your appetite for a preloading and S4 migration with a redesign project. Obviously, the cleaner your role design is, the more it's based on best practices such as SU24, the easier the actual lift and shift is. Assuming you have a great role concept with, let's say best case scenario, single roles, all built using SU24, SOD free, lifting and shifting that and just replacing the objects and making them work is significantly easier than dealing with a messy role concept that halfway in you realize, oh, but by making those changes, my SODs are getting worse, and now we have audit complaining and we need to fix. You just need to be aware. If you decide to lift and shift a messy security concept, it's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse, right? And so you either deal with that during that migration and allot time for that, or you say, you know what, we're just going to lift and shift, make sure everyone is working, even if they have way too many authorizations. And then once we are live on S4, we're going to do a redesign. Those are your options. It really depends on timeline, budget, appetite for doing it before, during, or after. But you'll have to, ideally, you'll fix it at some point.
Perfect. Then there was another question regarding, you showed those virtual changes you did in role design. That there was a question whether we can analyze SODs when you do those changes.
Yes, yeah, that's a good question, because typically when especially when you use access control, maybe you either run a simulation on roles that already exist, or you get warnings if you try to assign roles that would constitute an SOD conflict. Now, with the role designer in particular, you can bring the SOD analysis into the role design phase. So as you build roles virtually, and before you generate them in PFCG, you can already run an SOD analysis against your access control rule set. If you don't have access control, you can use a built-in rule set that we deliver, or you can import one that you got from your auditor maybe. But the bottom line is, yes, you can take the SOD analysis and make it part of the design process, which helps you generate roles that don't cause, you already know up front if that's going to be an SOD or not, and you can decide if you want to live with that or not.
Perfect. And I think that was a little bit of misunderstanding of the reference user. I'm not sure whether we should spend another minute to explain it once again.
Yeah, that was a little short here, but so let's talk about traditional testing real quick. So when you're done with your updating your roles or migrating your roles to S4, you would typically set up a test environment, you write your test scripts, you get your testers together, and you run through the test process. And whenever the tester gets stuck due to missing or incorrect authorizations, someone has to figure out what is missing. And you typically do this by running an SU53 trace, finding out what's missing. You fix it and you ask the tester to try again. And that typically leads to a back and forth that is time consuming and not very efficient. The reference user concept takes it to a different level. So what we would do there is, we would assume we have the tester, that in tester is in gray. And what we do is we create a new user of type reference. So there is a user type in SAP that's called reference users. SAP introduced reference users for an entirely different use case, but let's ignore that for now. What you need to know is that you create a standard reference user in SAP. You assign that reference user to the dialog user or to the tester, and you assign the roles that you want to test to the reference user. So instead of assigning them directly to the tester, you assign them to the reference user. The tester gets that special SAP app role that allows the tester to run through all applications without running into an authorization issue. So it provides full access to all the applications. And that's important because now we can let the tester run through the test script without ever being stopped, and we can find out what the delta is between our new roles and the you can do everything type of role. And the way that's done is by making or leveraging the fact that the SAP kernel, whenever there is an authority check that needs to be done, always does it against the reference user first, if there is one assigned. So if the tester runs BP, the kernel does the authority check first against the reference user and the roles associated to the reference user before repeating it, if it fails, against the dialog user. So let's assume we made a big mistake. We forgot to authorize our tester for BP. The tester runs BP, the kernel does an authority check against the reference user, BP is missing, so we get an authorization issue or error on the back end only. Then the kernel immediately repeats the authority check against the dialog user, and because the dialog user or test user has SAP app, it succeeds. So the tester can go into BP and does whatever, update vendor data or customer data whatsoever. But because it failed here first, we get a return code 0 on the backend log. And those return code 0s are the indications of where we have gaps in the roles that we've assigned to our respective reference users. So we can see, okay, what reference user had what gap, or what roles assigned to those reference users had gaps. So we can take that gap analysis, we can go back to the dev system, and we can fix those roles without ever having to bother the tester to wait for us to fix that stuff, because the tester ran through everything without ever being stopped. But on the back end, we get the gap analysis, we take it, we fix those roles, we transport them up to our QA system, and we run through the test one more time. Now, in an S4 migration scenario, we don't have a production system, but if you imagine, and that goes back to the question, or should I do a role redesign before in ECC? If you decide to do a redesign in ECC, then you can leverage the very same capability for your ECC redesign, but instead of running through a test script with SAP app, you run this in production, and you assume that the dialog user, or you don't assume, but the dialog user has whatever he or she has currently assigned, and our tester, or I'm sorry, our reference user has the redesigned role. So you can leverage the very same capability in ECC in production, and that means instead of having to run through a test script, you simply let your dialog user go about his or her daily job and do whatever they do in the system, and we use that as a means to do a gap analysis. So this is even more powerful in ECC. On S4, we don't have a production reference system to simply let users do their job, so we have to run through a test script, but nevertheless, it significantly speeds up the test cycle. I hope that made more sense.
I hope it did. I think that's pretty much it, Michael, with all the questions. I think we're also over the time, so thank you very much for answering them.
Okay, cool. Anything we didn't get to, we'll follow up via email, and we'll take it from there. And also, you get an email, as I've mentioned, with the recording, with a copy of the slide deck. But if there is anything that didn't make sense, if you wanna, do a one-on-one demo or whatever, just reply to that email, let us know, and then we'll take care of you. Thank you very much for spending over an hour with us. Much appreciated. Stay healthy, stay home, and don't forget about tomorrow's webinar about hacking Google. No, using Google to hack SAP. Alessandro is going to deliver that, so stay tuned for that.